Hi, folks, and welcome to the third of the 5 webinars that we're conducting this week. If everyone who's going to be presenting or answering questions, if you could turn on your cameras really quickly so we could see who you are, and then we'll turn them off when we actually do the presentation so you have full screen. So for this webinar, we're going to be doing an in-depth review of the Model Ordinance, or the Model Mandatory Organics Disposal Reduction Ordinance. It's a mouthful to say, so I'll just refer to it as an ordinance. As a note, these webinars are being recorded, and the PowerPoints, will be posted after they're converted to ADA compliance. So we will let people know via listserv once they're posted, but hopefully pretty shortly. We'll also be taking live questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have a question, please put an asterisk in the chat feature of the GoToWebinar. If you are logged in through the broadcast, you will not have this feature. So if you need the link to the GoToWebinar, please email the SLCP inbox and we'll get you the link. In order to be most effective for this presentation, please keep all questions focused on the model tool. For other questions not related to the models, feel free to either contact your local assistance representative or email the SLCP inbox, and we will get a response to you as soon as possible. Before we dive into the presentation, I would like to thank HF&H, Deborah Kaufman Consulting, and Diversion Strategies for developing the model tools. And I would also like to thank the resource group, as well as the CalRecycle staff who contributed to the tools. So before we start the presentation, I would like to do some quick introductions. So we have Rob Hilton. Since 2002, Mr. Hilton has provided recycling and solid waste consulting services to public agencies covering a range of strategic, operational, programmatic, contractual, and financial issues. Rob leads HF&H's franchising team, supporting over a dozen communities annually and competitively procuring and negotiating collection, processing, and disposal contracts. Rob also leads HF&H's 1383 efforts, including direction of over 20 1383 projects, such as implementation plans, compliant franchises, compliant ordinances, and the development of the model tools, which we're about to talk about. He's also hosted several 1383 local government summits and has spoken many times to jurisdictions on 1383 compliance. Also on the line, we have Tracy Swanborn. Tracy is a senior manager with HF&H. She has 30 years of consulting experience assisting local governments. Her expertise is in planning diversion programs, managing competitive procurements for collection, processing, and disposal, and developing contracts and ordinances. Tracy's has been focused on 1383 and actively tracking the rulemaking, presenting 1383 requirements to jurisdictions, and assisting jurisdictions with the preparation of action plans and compliant franchises. She managed the development of the 1383 model tools, which include the franchise, the ordinance, which we'll go over, the procurement policy, which we'll go over tomorrow, along with the edible recovery agreement, which we'll go over tomorrow afternoon. And last is Deborah Kaufman. She is a zero waste and sustainability consultant with more than 30 years of experience helping local governments plan and implement zero waste programs and facilities, developing recycling, organics, and procurement policies, advocating for and interpreting statewide recycling and composting laws, and conducting strategic planning. She was the project manager for the development of Stop Waste Mandatory Recycling and Organics Ordinance, and she led the development of the Model Organics Disposal Reduction Ordinance and Organics Procurement Policy for CalRecycle with HF&H. She also has experience with ordinance and development and policy development, adoption, and implementation. And for the CalRecycle side, we have representatives from the solid waste facilities, enforcement, and local assistance, and myself, who is the SB 1383 implementation manager. With that said, I will turn it over to Rob Hilton to take it away.
Thank you, Ashley, and good afternoon to everybody. So as most of you know, SB 1383 is the most significant waste reduction mandate to be adopted in California in the last 30 years, and it has a significant implication on state and local governments, on generators, on service providers throughout the state. And so to assist jurisdictions with the implementation of SB 1383, HF&H consultants, in collaboration with Diversion Strategies and Deborah Kaufman, have developed these 4 model tools under CalRecycle's leadership: the Model Franchise Agreement, the Model Mandatory Organics Disposal Reduction Ordinance, Model Organic Waste Product Procurement Policy, and the Model Edible Food Recovery Agreement, which are the subject of these webinars. This presentation is focused on the Model Mandatory Organics Disposal Reduction Ordinance tool, and if you don't mind, I'll just say Model Ordinance for the remainder of the presentation, which was developed to provide jurisdictions with language to supplement and expand their current municipal code to enforce compliance with SB 1383. Before we go any further, I do need to go into the fine print a little bit. The model ordinance is for example purposes only, and it shouldn't be duplicated without considering each individual jurisdiction's particular needs and circumstances. It is not intended to cover each and every situation, and we could not anticipate every one-off specific need, though we've tried to accommodate a wide range of things in here. We've done our best to align the language in the model with the regulations, but in the event of a conflict, obviously the language in the regulations and the official rulemaking record should prevail over the language in the tool. And it's important to note that each jurisdiction is ultimately responsible for its own compliance with the regulations and is advised to seek legal counsel and other support in developing and modifying their ordinances. So, that out of the way, we'll start with a little bit of an overview of SB 1383, highlighting some of the specific issues that relate to the ordinance. Then we'll discuss the objectives of the model mandatory ordinance, review how it was developed, how it's structured, and some items to think about as you're using this tool. And then we'll go through the ordinance section by section, covering the focus of each section and pointing out some of the customization options and guidance notes that exist in each area. The presentation will probably be about an hour, and we'll have the remainder of the time for Q&A, and we'll try and move through this promptly to get to that. So, SB 1383 establishes organic waste reduction targets. It builds on the mandatory commercial organics recycling law, AB 1826, that jurisdictions have been working to implement since 2016. It sets a goal for Californians to reduce the disposal of organic waste by 50% by 2020 and 75% by 2025 compared to the baseline established in the 2014 Waste Characterization Study, where we were disposing about 23 million tons a year of organic waste in California. As a result, these disposal reductions should generate at least 8 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emission reductions annually by 2030. And again, the focus of this regulation is to reduce the impact on climate change. The law also establishes a target to recover 20% of currently disposed edible food for human consumption by 2025. And it's important to note that under the law, organic waste covers several materials, not just the food and yard trimmings that we were thinking about under AB 1826, but also paper and cardboard and wood waste. Important to note, the regulations take effect in 2022, and on the next slide, we'll walk through some of the key dates and issues. So to meet the regulatory deadline of January 1, 2022, CalRecycle expects that jurisdictions will begin planning and making programmatic and budgetary decisions regarding those requirements now. 1383 defines a jurisdiction as a city and county, and also special districts that have solid waste powers. By 2022, jurisdictions are going to be required to have an ordinance, which is the primary focus of this presentation, have an organics collection service for all residents and businesses up and running, and these services need to be provided automatically to residents and businesses if they generate organic waste. Jurisdictions need to implement edible food recovery programs established for Tier 1 generators by January of 2022, and for those additional Tier 2 generators by January of 2024. Jurisdictions are to conduct compliant education and outreach efforts, procure recovered organic waste products and paper products, assess and plan for organic processing and edible food recovery capacity within the county, and conduct monitoring activities, including desk audits, route reviews, and inspections of edible food generators. Now, during the first 2 years of implementation, jurisdictions must, at a minimum, provide education and outreach to non-compliant generators. CalRecycle can begin enforcement actions on jurisdictions and other entities starting in January of 2022, and jurisdictions will be required to take enforcement action against their non-compliant entities in 2024. CalRecycle does have some funding available through some competitive grant programs as well as loan programs for establishing the infrastructure for recycling organic waste as well as recovering edible food, but that's specific to the infrastructure development. The ongoing programmatic activities such as enforcement, inspections, education, provision of collection services, and those staffing things and budgetary changes that are needed still rest with the jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions need to work towards those things. Really, the big takeaway is jurisdictions need to begin planning now, if they haven't already, in order to have all of the programmatic staffing and budgetary changes in place by January of 2022. Getting started early is also important, especially with regard to the ordinance, because it extends beyond the waste management and recycling staff in the city. It ends up touching a good number of departments and organizations within a jurisdiction. So right at the top, obviously, we have city councils and boards of supervisors, the elected bodies for jurisdictions that need to pass these ordinances by January of 2022 to require all businesses and residents to subscribe to the services. We'll have finance and legal staff involved in development of the ordinances and establishing new fees or processes in the city to manage the implementation of the ordinance policies. City manager's office or the county administrator's office is going to be very involved in directing how work gets assigned among divisions in the jurisdiction, as there are a number of different departments and divisions that may be affected by this. That includes environmental health departments that may be assisting in the implementation of the edible food recovery program and the inspection regimes, as well as public parks, transportation, and purchasing departments that all have a role in implementing the organic procurement requirements. So without going into all of the tendrils of the regulations, there are a number of departments that get engaged in this that aren't normally, and you'll probably find that those folks are tied up with other things in the normal course of their work. So getting their engagement, getting their focus on this is going to need to be a priority. So the most basic element of the regulation is that jurisdictions are required to automatically provide an organic waste collection service to each of the residents and businesses. The regulations also require all businesses and residents to use an organic waste recycling service that meets the regulatory requirements. There's a whole lot of detail about the types of allowable collection programs, but at a high level, it requires that each resident and business be provided with the appropriate number of containers and subscribe to an organic waste collection service that can be either a source-separated program or a one-bin unsegregated program, in which case the service provider must transport all of that unsegregated waste to a facility that recovers 50% of the organic content collected by 2022, and then 75% of the organic content collected by 2025. The regulations allow for a menu of collection options to meet the needs of different jurisdictions, and jurisdictions may have a combination of those systems within their cities. So you may find that you've got a 3-container system for your single-family residential generators, but a 2-container system for commercial generators. That's okay as long as each generator is provided a compliant system. In a 1-container system, the jurisdiction is responsible for ensuring that the contents are transported to one of those high diversion organic waste processing facilities that recovers the specified amount of organic content. In a 2-container system, at least one of those containers, whichever is not source separated, needs to be transported to such a facility. In a 3-container system, the organic waste is separated from the disposal material, paper and cardboard in the blue container, food and yard waste in the green container, and in that case, there's no required recovery rate for the 3-container system. The 3-container system can also have additional articulation of the separation scheme. For example, you could put fibers on one side of a recycling container and containers on the other side of the recycling cart. Or you could separate food scraps from yard trimmings and put those food scraps into a brown container. So these same rules will apply to entities that are not subject to local control. In those cases, CalRecycle will oversee those non-local entities that include state agencies, University of California, California State University System, community colleges, K through 12 schools, and those other entities that are not subject to local oversight. Jurisdictions must regulate and have enforceable requirements for the haulers that collect organic waste in their jurisdiction, and also for commercial and residential generators and self-haulers. The model tool recognizes that different jurisdictions may be using different collection configurations, and as such, we've got language in various sections that addresses that with some guidance and customization notes and shaded colors for jurisdictions to modify the ordinance to address the collection systems that they select, and Deborah will talk more about that later. By January of 2022, jurisdictions are required to have an enforcement mechanism or ordinance in place, but it is at the jurisdiction's discretion to implement those enforcement mechanisms between January of 22 and the end of December 23. During that time period, jurisdictions at a minimum need to identify businesses in violation and provide educational materials to those generators. The focus during those first 2 years is on education, and the goal is to make sure that by January of 2024, when the enforcement comes into effect, every generator has plenty of opportunity to come into compliance before that enforcement period. After 2024, jurisdictions need to take progressive enforcement against organic waste generators and other regulated entities that are not in compliance. The progressive approach allows for notification to the regulated entity and provides ample time to comply before penalties are required to be issued by the jurisdiction. Jurisdictions are not required to impose penalties on generators found in violation of prohibited container contaminant requirements. And CalRecycle sets a maximum time frame that a jurisdiction has to issue notices of violations and issue penalties to the generator. So as you're thinking about the enforcement ordinances, make sure that you're paying attention to those timelines that are in your regulations. Jurisdictions do have flexibility to develop their own enforcement processes within those parameters. And when a jurisdiction determines a violation has occurred, it's required at a minimum to issue a notice of violation requiring compliance within 60 days of issuance of the notice. And if the generator has still not complied within 60 days, the jurisdiction is then responsible to issue penalties. The regulations set a minimum penalty amount of at least $50 for the first violation within a year, and that can go up to $500 a day for multiple violations occurring within a year. So really, an early, robust education program is key to minimizing the amount of future enforcement action that's needed, and that's critical to managing both the resources required for this as well as the community impacts of it. Article 14 of SB 1383 lays out the enforcement requirements for jurisdictions, and this includes the compliance reviews, route reviews, and inspections process. Annual compliance reviews of commercial businesses are required for jurisdictions using either the 3, 2, or 3+ container separation systems. And those annual compliance reviews of the businesses are like the reviews jurisdictions should be doing now to verify compliance with mandatory organics recycling under AB 1826. The requirement specifically is to perform the review for commercial businesses that generate 2 cubic yards or more per week of solid waste. That includes all subscribed services, trash, recycling, organics, any other separations that they may have. The idea of the audit is that it is a desk audit that involves a review of reports from the service providers to verify that service is provided or that the businesses are complying. It's not intended to be primarily a field audit. For contamination management in the 2 or 3 container collection service, there are 2 options. Route reviews are one strategy, and jurisdictions are supposed to conduct route reviews of commercial businesses and residential areas. The route reviews are used to verify generator subscription to the required collection service. This entails seeing that the business has the appropriate external containers, and if a business does not use the hauler service, it would involve verifying the business's self-hauling or self-management of the material is happening according to the law. Note that random inspection of routes does not require going inside of a business to verify that they have the appropriate containers and labels inside of the business. Waste evaluation studies are a second strategy for verifying compliance, and that process involves sampling materials from the routes and assessing the contamination levels within the material collected. The route reviews or waste composition studies, waste evaluation studies may be delegated to the haulers, but they are still the jurisdiction's primary responsibility. Jurisdictions with a single one container unsegregated collection service need to verify with the hauler that the contents of the gray container are transported to a high diversion organic waste processing facility and that that facility is meeting the requirements of SB 1383 related to the recovery rate. Note that CalRecycle will be identifying in the future which facilities are high diversion, as those facilities will be reporting into CalRecycle. There are no route reviews required for jurisdictions with one container systems. Essentially, the waste evaluation that's done of the one container system is the primary tool. The model ordinance provides language that gives jurisdictions the authority to inspect containers, records, and facilities, as well as to enforce compliance on generators, haulers, and processors. And this language is included in section 16 and 17 of the model, and we'll review those later on in the presentation. But again, it's really critically important that you engage with local legal counsel to make sure those provisions are consistent with local law and local practices that you have in your jurisdiction, as things like inspection can be very localized. With regard to the edible food recovery programs, jurisdictions must also have an enforcement and inspection program for those edible food generators. These types of inspections will be new for jurisdictions, and jurisdictions need to plan resources to conduct those inspections. You may consider partnering with health inspectors that are already visiting food servers and food generators. Inspections on Tier 1 commercial edible food generators begin in January of 22, and for Tier 2 in January of 24. This inspection involves verifying that they have contracts for written agreements with a food recovery service or organization, verifying that they have arranged to have the edible food recovered that would otherwise be disposed, verifying that they're complying with the commercial edible food generator record keeping requirements, and verifying that they are not intentionally spoiling food that could be recovered. If a jurisdiction is already implementing an edible food recovery program and conducting inspections, such as through the health department, the model ordinance may need to be modified to reflect your local practices and approach. Enforcement requirements on other generators and haulers will be discussed later in this presentation. Jurisdictions will have to adopt an ordinance and other enforceable requirements that require compliance with specified Cal Green and water efficient landscaping, WELO requirements. Unless you already have such an ordinance or enforceable mechanism in place in your jurisdiction, and many agencies did adopt these. The requirements specifically include providing readily accessible areas for recycling containers in commercial and multifamily units, providing organic waste commingled with C&D debris to meet CalGreen's 65% requirement for C&D recycling in both residential and non-residential projects, requiring new construction and landscaping projects to meet WELO requirements for compost and mulch application. And section 13 and 14 of the model ordinance specifically address these requirements and provide further guidance on suggested modifications. So at this point, I've wrapped up the overview of the key 1383 regulations related to the ordinance, and now I'm going to shift gears to hand it over to Deborah Kaufman to talk about the details of the model ordinance itself.
Thank you, Rob, for the SB 1383 overview. Okay, I'm going to spend the next approximately 50 minutes presenting an overview of the model mandatory ordinance and cover details of each of the 18 sections of the model ordinance, which is designed for use by jurisdictions, starting with objectives and structure of the model. The objective of the model mandatory organics disposal reduction ordinance is to provide jurisdictions with a tool to support their compliance with SB 1383. Jurisdictions are required to have an enforceable ordinance or other enforceable mechanism to address the regulatory requirements that jurisdictions need to enforce on entities under their authority. I want to note that not all jurisdictional requirements are addressed through the model ordinance. The focus really is on the entities under the jurisdiction's authority. There are other SB 1383 requirements on jurisdictions not intended to be addressed in this model, including certain record keeping, contamination monitoring, and outreach and reporting requirements. Those other requirements may need to be addressed separately in other policies, program implementation, franchise agreements, or other planning documents. The model tool has been designed to serve as a resource for jurisdictions that are either creating a new ordinance or amending existing municipal code. And we anticipate that jurisdictions will pick and choose elements of the model tool that are relevant to them. We also anticipate jurisdictions may integrate the model tool into their current municipal code. Throughout the model tool, guidance notes are provided to help users understand the regulations and compliance strategies. And I want to emphasize that having an ordinance in place is not the specific requirement. The requirement is that jurisdictions have an enforceable ordinance or similarly enforceable mechanism to support compliance with SB 1383. Regardless of the mechanism, the language provided in the model should prove useful. With the next 5 slides, I'll cover the structure of the ordinance and discuss how best to use it for varying circumstances. I'd like to briefly discuss how the model ordinance was developed and what you can expect. The model was designed to be customizable for a diverse range of jurisdictions, while at the same time providing flexibility for unique conditions that may exist. Upon revision, it can be used as a standalone document, or it can be used to amend existing policies. The model is reflective of regulatory language. Guidance notes are directly embedded throughout the model ordinance to provide context for provisions, guide users on strategies for tailoring language, and also to highlight relevant SB 1383 regulations. I'd like to note some important considerations to think about as you use the model ordinance. The model ordinance can be used by jurisdictions drafting a complete overhaul of their municipal code and also those amending existing sections. It's recommended that users consider use of existing sections subject to review and revision as needed. For amendments to existing sections, example language in the model can be integrated into the jurisdiction's existing municipal code, but do be careful of defined terms. If a jurisdiction is merging language from existing documents, you need to ensure that there are no inconsistencies with the way terms are used. Each jurisdiction is responsible for understanding and complying with SB 1383. Use of the model ordinance doesn't exempt a jurisdiction from complying with all of the SB 1383 requirements. And also, not all requirements can be fulfilled through delegation. It's advised that jurisdictions thoroughly review the SB 1383 regulations and take necessary actions to ensure full compliance. Also, any ordinance that results from the use of the model should not be considered to have undergone legal counsel review. Each jurisdiction is responsible for involving its own legal counsel to perform legal review in relationship to local legal issues. It's advised that the amendment process involves engagement with the involved parties. That process could include the generators, haulers, and may include transfer and processing contractors. The language in the model ordinance provides examples only. Jurisdictions aren't required to use this language. All the language should be considered in the context of the jurisdiction's unique conditions. Customization and modification is expected to reflect each jurisdiction's unique circumstances and programs. The Model Mandatory Organics Disposal Reduction Ordinance is a colorful document, as you can see in the slide. Text highlights and colors, as displayed in this screenshot, provide guidance and optionality. Guidance notes are highlighted in green, and are integrated into the model to explain how specific sections and provisions can be customized for a jurisdiction's needs. Additional information on SB 1383 regulations is embedded in many of these guidance notes. SB 1383 specific regulatory language is shown in blue font. Customization notes are highlighted in blue and identify various options or areas where specific information can be inserted or selected. And language not specific to SB 1383 regulations is shown in black font. SB 1383 regulations define two compliance options for jurisdictions, a standard-based and a performance-based approach. The standard compliance approach provides jurisdictions more flexibility in their compliance approach. The performance-based compliance approach requires jurisdictions to provide a 3-container collection system to 90% of the commercial and residential sectors and use of facilities that meet specific performance standards. Use of this approach also waives some requirements of SB 1383. The compliance approach chosen will affect the provisions and structures of a jurisdiction's ordinance. If a jurisdiction chooses the performance-based compliance approach but then doesn't achieve it, the jurisdiction may need to add provisions to comply with the standard compliance approach. Ordinance language that differs for the standard compliance approach and performance-based approach are identified in the section headings and guidance notes. If there isn't a guidance note or a customization note distinguishing the section for standard or performance-based, then the section is applicable to jurisdictions regardless of the type of compliance system they've chosen. Some SB 1383 requirements differ based on the type of jurisdiction. For example, city and county, or special district providing solid waste collection services. Jurisdiction is defined in the regulations. And jurisdictions should choose the customization options that best match the requirements of their jurisdiction type. For example, there are different requirements for a county, and a jurisdiction could delete those specific county requirements. Ordinance provisions that differ based on the jurisdiction type will be identified in the guidance notes in the model ordinance. I want to note that the model does not address the full framework that a regional agency or a special district providing solid waste handling services will need to capture for its relationship with its member agencies. These type of jurisdictions will need to make modifications to the ordinance depending on their specific requirements. Users of the model ordinance are advised to consider which requirements of SB 1383 will remain the responsibility of the jurisdiction and which will be delegated to other parties like the haulers, other contractors, or a regional agency. For example, some jurisdictions may have an agreement with their regional agency to perform the compliance monitoring and inspections, and others may do it themselves. Options are presented that address different delegation scenarios. It should be kept in mind that not all activities can be delegated, however, to private entities. For example, imposing civil penalties and granting waivers cannot be delegated to private entities. It's important to note that regardless of how a jurisdiction chooses to handle enforcement, the jurisdiction itself could be subject to penalties based on non-enforcement. The remainder of my presentation will focus on reviewing the specific sections, the 18 sections of the model ordinance, and highlighting their contents. This is a list of each section provided in the model ordinance. I'll use the next 22 slides to introduce the 18 sections of the ordinance, noting highlights, guidance notes, and customization options. Section 1, Purpose and Findings, states the general purpose of the ordinance and highlights applicable laws such as AB 939, AB 341, AB 1826, and of course, SB 1383. Other laws are broadly stated, and as such, the ordinance is not limited to SB 1383 requirements. Except for the findings and purpose section, however, all aspects of the model ordinance were written to be specific to SB 1383 requirements, unless otherwise indicated in a guidance note. Rural jurisdictions that are exempt from AB 1826 can remove language related to AB 1826. Jurisdictions should customize language based on their own compliance approach, jurisdiction-specific diversion goals, and/or other policies of the jurisdiction. Section 2 of the ordinance provides a suggested title, Mandatory Organics Disposal Reduction Ordinance, perhaps MODRO. The title is not a specific requirement of SB 1383, and it can be modified by the jurisdiction. Section 3 provides defined terms for the model ordinance. You'll notice that most are reflective of the definitions used in SB 1383, but they don't include all the definitions provided in the regulations. Note that commercial businesses include multifamily residential dwellings with 5 or more units, and residential includes 4 and under units. It's recommended that jurisdictions review all defined terms in the SB 1383 regulations. Other definitions that have been included are from example ordinances and franchise agreements. Key terms, which I'll review on the next slide, are based on container color and material type. And where we could, we intentionally kept some of the definitions broad to allow for customization by jurisdictions. Jurisdictions should tailor these definitions so that they align with your collection system and franchise agreement provisions, including how enforcement responsibilities have been allocated between the city, the hauler, and/or a third party. Jurisdictions should also customize the definitions provided for non-local entities to ensure that they accurately represent your non-local entities, such as special districts and military installations that may or may not be located within your jurisdiction. To orient you to the model ordinance, I want to walk through some of the key definitions to provide you important context for reviewing the document. CalRecycle wanted to use the defined terms in the model ordinance for recyclables, organics, and solid waste that align as closely as possible with definitions in SB 1383 regulations. This slide summarizes that approach in umbrella terms. We refer to the containers by color throughout the document. Some jurisdictions will need to change color terminology to match the colors they use for their containers until uniform container colors are implemented by January 1, 2036. Source-separated recyclable materials that you see here is the broadest of the terms and includes both non-organic recyclables and organic recyclables. Non-organic recyclables means non-putrescible and non-hazardous recyclable waste, such as the glass, the metal, and plastic, and it's only used in jurisdictions with a 2 or 3 container system. Organic recyclables is called SSB-COW on this slide, which stands for Source-Separated Blue Container Organic Waste, and is intended to reflect recyclable materials that are also organic in nature, such as paper products and writing papers, and are required to be collected in the blue recyclable container for jurisdictions using a 2 or 3 container approach. It's important to remember that in the context of SB 1383, organic waste also includes organic recyclables, such as fibers, textiles, and cardboard. As a result, organic waste includes both blue and green container organics, or source-separated blue container organic waste and source-separated green container organic waste, shown as SSG-COW on this slide. Source-separated green container organic waste is intended to reflect the more traditional organic materials, such as the food, green material, landscape, and pruning waste, and it's provided as a term for materials collected in a green container. Both SSB-COW and SSG-COW are definitions used in the ordinance to help distinguish what materials go in what type and color containers, but they're not definitions contained in the SB 1383 regulations. For a 3 container system, the solid waste is referred to as gray container waste. Per SB 1383, this definition is limited to waste in a 3 container system. For 2 container or 1 container systems where waste is processed through a high diversion facility, mixed waste is the term used. This This slide presents a visual representation of what definitions look like in the ordinance and how you can customize them to reflect your jurisdiction's collection system. Here we see the gray container and gray container waste definitions. Under the gray container definition, a guidance note highlighted in green notifies the user that this definition should be changed to mixed waste if the jurisdiction is using a 2-container or 1-container collection system. Under the gray container waste definition, a guidance note highlighted in green notifies the user that this definition is only needed for jurisdictions using a 3-container or 3+ container system. Section 4 provides the framework for a collection system under the standard compliance approach specifically for single-family generators. Jurisdictions are required to provide a compliant collection system to all single-family generators and multifamily premises with less than 5 units. While the word auto-enroll was struck from the regulations, it's the intent of the regulations that jurisdictions provide service to all generators in some way. This automatic provision of service is required under both the standard and performance-based compliance approaches. And single-family generators are required to properly source separate their discarded materials based on the collection system offered by their jurisdiction. Jurisdictions should modify this section based on their collection system, which would dictate which containers are used for specific material types. We've provided language for a 3-container, 2-container, and 1-container system. And we've also provided some language in this section for jurisdictions that allow self-hauling of organic materials. The language also points users to Section 12, which provides more detailed information on self-hauling requirements for jurisdictions that allow it. Jurisdictions should also modify this section based on potential sector-specific activities. For example, if a 2-container system is provided for multifamily and commercial customers, and a 3-container system is provided to single-family residences, the ordinance needs to be amended to reflect that approach. And lastly, jurisdictions that receive low population, rural, and/or high elevation waivers from CalRecycle will need to amend this section based on those waivers. For each waiver, some SB 1383 requirements are still applicable, and AB 341 and 1826 are still applicable. And I'll be talking more about waivers in a couple of minutes. Section 5 focuses on requirements for single-family generators in a jurisdiction using the performance-based compliance approach. This section also applies to multifamily premises with less than 5 units. You may choose to have a special section discretely for multifamily rather than combined with single-family. Under the performance-based compliance approach, jurisdictions are required to provide 3-container service to all residents. As with the standard compliance approach, the intent of the regulations is that service be provided to all generators in some type of automatic or universal way. Under the performance-based compliance approach, at least 90% of all residential generators must be provided a 3-container system. Under this compliance approach, jurisdictions are exempt from a number of SB 1383 requirements, including regulation of haulers and self-haulers, waivers and exemption requirements, and enforcement provisions, with the exception of enforcement related to edible food generators and food recovery organizations and services. There are other regulatory requirements that a jurisdiction using a performance-based compliance approach would also be exempt from, such as certain record keeping, education, outreach, and reporting requirements, but those are not intended to be addressed by this ordinance. The ordinance also provides language that gives jurisdictions the ability to specify the number, size, and location of containers provided to generators, which may be useful for jurisdictions with large multifamily complexes. Optional language is also provided for jurisdictions that allow organic material self-hauling. Section 6 provides the framework for a compliant collection system under the standard compliance approach, specifically for commercial businesses, which includes multifamily residential dwellings with 5 or more units. Jurisdictions are required to provide organic collection container service to all commercial businesses using some type of automatic or universal provision of service. Such generators are required to properly separate their discarded materials based on the collection system offered by their jurisdiction. Jurisdictions should modify this section based on their collection system. We provided some language also for jurisdictions that allow self-hauling of organic materials. And that language points users to Section 12 for more detail on self-hauling requirements, which I will get to. Jurisdictions should also modify this section based on potential generator sector specific collection differences. As I mentioned earlier, if a 2-container system, for example, is provided for multifamily and commercial, and a 3-container system is provided to single family, the ordinance would need to be amended to reflect that approach. And lastly, jurisdictions that receive low population, rural, and/or high elevation waivers from CalRecycle will need to amend this section based on those waivers. And as you can see, the structure of the model is very similar between commercial and residential requirements. Section 7 provides the framework for a compliant collection system for commercial businesses under the performance-based compliance approach, which includes multifamily dwellings with 5 or more units. Jurisdictions are required to provide 3-container collection service to all commercial businesses using some type of automatic or universal provision of service, including for multifamily. And as I mentioned, under the performance-based compliance approach, at least 90% of all commercial generators also must be provided a 3-container system. As I mentioned in Section 5 on single-family requirements, jurisdictions using the performance-based compliance approach are not required to fulfill a number of SB 1383 requirements, including regulation of haulers and self-haulers, waivers and exemptions, and enforcement provisions, with the exception of enforcement related to edible food generators and food recovery organizations and services. The ordinance also allows for language modifications surrounding the minimum required service levels, which a jurisdiction could change over time. Optional language is also provided for jurisdictions allowing organic material self-hauling to a designated facility. Section 8 of the model covers waivers. SB 1383 regulations allow for both jurisdictional and generator waivers, but Section 8 of the model ordinance only contains language for generator waivers, as the jurisdictional waivers are granted by CalRecycle and wouldn't be governed by jurisdiction's ordinance. That said, I will cover some of the jurisdictional waivers that may be available in a few slides, as it is relevant to what requirements a jurisdiction with a waiver would include in their ordinance. With respect to generator waivers, SB 1383 allows jurisdictions to grant waivers to some generators for de minimis volumes, physical space limitations, and less than weekly collection frequency, although none of these waivers are required to be offered. The model ordinance includes sample language should a jurisdiction decide to include waivers for generators that meet specified requirements. For de minimis waivers, the jurisdiction must verify every 5 years that the commercial business's total solid waste collection service is below a certain number of gallons per week of organic waste, which includes all 3 streams of material. For physical space waivers, the jurisdiction must verify every 5 years that the premises lack adequate space for organic waste containers. And for collection frequency, that can be changed to every 14 days for blue and gray containers in a 2 or 3 container system under specified conditions and with approval from your local enforcement agency. Section 8 provides model language for the optional generator waivers that I just described. If generator waivers are used, the jurisdiction's implementation record required by SB 1383 must include documentation of businesses that applied for those waivers if the jurisdiction is using the standard compliance approach. And a jurisdiction can also choose to mix and match which, if any, waivers are offered to businesses. In that case, a jurisdiction would remove language related to waivers that are not being offered. With respect to jurisdictional waivers, jurisdictions can apply for specified low population, rural area, or high elevation waivers if they meet certain criteria. Jurisdictions may need to modify the provisions of their ordinance depending upon whether they plan to apply for and are granted these specific waivers from CalRecycle. Jurisdictions that receive low population, rural, or high elevation waivers may exempt some or all organic waste generators from some or all generator requirements as specified in the waiver. But jurisdictions that receive an SB 1383 low population waiver are still subject to implementing AB 341 and AB 1826 in those low population areas. Jurisdictional waivers are valid for up to 5 years for low populations and until December 31st, 2026, or 5 years after CalRecycle's approval, whichever's later for rural jurisdictions. And the regulations don't place an expiration of time limit on high elevation waivers. Section 9 defines the requirements for commercial edible food generators to use a food recovery service or organization for diverting edible food. It lists the required records that a commercial edible food generator must retain, such as the food organization or service it will be using, the types of food to be collected, and copies of written agreements. Additionally, this section includes language to allow jurisdictions access to the premises to review records. Record keeping by commercial edible food generators is required by SB 1383, but record submission is not. Jurisdictions could consider adding language that generators submit their records to the jurisdiction annually or on another basis to reduce the need for on-site inspection to verify compliance or look at records. Jurisdictions may also want to receive records on the amount and type of food that's being rejected by a food recovery organization, either to ensure proper delivery standards are maintained to ensure food safety or to follow up with why the food was rejected. However, neither of those things are required by the SB 1383 regulations. And just as a reminder, food donated to food recovery organizations and services is protected under the California Good Samaritan Food Donation Act of 2017, which expanded the liability protection for businesses that donate food. Section 10 defines the requirements for food recovery organizations and services to retain documentation of the commercial edible food generators it services and the quantity in pounds of food collected and transported. The model ordinance includes language that the organization or service shall educate edible food generators about the Good Samaritan Food Act, although that's not required by SB 1383. There's also optional language that would require the food recovery organization to report the amount and type of edible food not accepted for follow-up action to be taken later. However, this is also not required by the regulation. And finally, there's language that would require food recovery organizations and services to provide information and consultation to jurisdictions to support edible food recovery capacity planning assessments or other studies conducted by the jurisdiction within a defined time frame. But none of these customization options are required by SB 1383. They're included for consideration by the jurisdiction. Section 11 on haulers addresses the regulatory requirements that must be placed on haulers for SB 1383 compliance. If a jurisdiction uses the performance-based compliance approach, they're not required to impose these requirements on haulers. However, they are required to approve the hauler and require the hauler to transport the source-separated organic waste stream to a designated source-separated organic waste recycling facility. Jurisdictions using the performance-based compliance approach can adopt some of these requirements in the event that they don't meet the requirements of that approach. Regardless of which compliance method the jurisdiction chooses, however, the hauler is still responsible for meeting the hauler requirements of SB 1383. And some of the requirements stated in the model ordinance may be better suited to being addressed in a franchise agreement or may be included in both. We recommend cross-referencing these requirements with franchise agreements and other hauler documents to ensure compliance and congruence between documents. Within the model, there are options for exclusive, non-exclusive, and permitted haulers, and language would need to be modified to match the jurisdiction's own collection arrangement. Section 12 addresses the regulatory requirements that must be placed on self-haulers to be SB 1383 compliant if self-hauling is allowed within the jurisdiction. Commercial self-haulers must keep a record of the amount of organic waste delivered to each facility that processes or recovers organic waste. And that record is subject to inspection by the jurisdiction and should include delivery receipts, weight tickets, and the amount of material in cubic yards or tons transported. If the self-hauler delivers to a facility that doesn't have a scale, the self-hauler is not required to keep a record of the weight, but must keep a record of the volume. Residential organic self-haulers aren't required to record or report information, including residential landscaping services. Section 13 addresses the requirement for a jurisdiction to have an ordinance or similarly enforceable mechanism to require organic waste commingled with C&D to be recycled per the CalGreen standards, as well as the requirement for provision of adequate space for recycling for new or renovated multifamily and commercial construction of a certain size. If the jurisdiction already has an ordinance or other enforceable mechanism requiring compliance with CalGreen, then this language can be removed from the model ordinance. It should be, I want to note that the complete CalGreen requirements aren't included in the model ordinance, and project applicants should be referred to a jurisdiction's planning or building code for other CalGreen requirements. Keep in mind that the CalGreen updates could be included in a different section of your municipal code than the rest of the model ordinance. And the model ordinance contains customizable sections to adapt the language for storage and collection of organics and recyclables based on your current collection system, whether that's a 1, 2, or 3 container system. Section 14 addresses the requirement for jurisdictions to meet or exceed the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, or MWELO standards. The model ordinance doesn't broadly address all the requirements of the MWELO, only those set by the SB 1383 baseline requirements, which focus on compost and mulch application. Similar to the CalGreen updates, the MWELO updates may need to be incorporated in a different section of the municipal code than the rest of the ordinance. If the jurisdiction adopts an ordinance that allows for an auto update of the MWELO standards, they still need to ensure that the MWELO standards set within SB 1383 are still met. If MWELO requirements are reduced, the SB 1383 requirements would still stand. So if a jurisdiction already has an existing MWELO ordinance or similarly enforceable mechanism, they can omit this provision, but they should be aware of auto updating provisions. Section 15 assists jurisdictions which for this purpose, for recovered organic waste product procurement purposes, are defined as cities, counties, or a city or county, or a city and county, such as San Francisco, in meeting their recovered organic waste product procurement requirements. It anticipates that a jurisdiction will adopt a procurement policy to address procurement of organic waste products such as compost, mulch, renewable natural gas, and electricity from biomass to meet their annual SB 1383 procurement target. It includes a sample provision that a jurisdiction's departments will comply with the organic waste product procurement policy should the jurisdiction choose to adopt one. It also outlines recycled content paper procurement requirements for vendors to support the jurisdiction's compliance with those requirements. And also, as a reminder, all cities, counties, and districts that provide solid waste handling services are subject to the recycled content paper procurement requirements starting January 1, 2022. Where rural jurisdictions that have an exemption from the organic waste collection requirements are allowed delayed implementation of the requirement. Adopting a procurement policy is not required by SB 1383, but it may help the jurisdiction in achieving their designated procurement target. If the jurisdiction currently has or decides to adopt a procurement policy, then less specific language can be used in the ordinance, and further detail may be described in the procurement policy. So a jurisdiction really has options on how to address these requirements. They can choose to include a more streamlined procurement section in the ordinance and have a separate procurement policy with more detail, or they might address these requirements only in a separate procurement or other policy, or only in this ordinance. Section 16, inspections, presents an approach to establishing the jurisdiction's right to inspect or investigate. Some jurisdictions may want to expand on this section to include more specifically who has the authority to inspect, what entities may be inspected or investigated, and the protocols for such inspections and investigations. Basic language has been included to direct jurisdictions to receive and follow up on anonymous complaints, and that complaints be made in writing with specified information. However, the actual application of that is up to the jurisdiction's discretion. To comply with contamination monitoring and the other inspection requirements of SB 1383, options are included around performing visual inspections of containers or also remote monitoring using cameras mounted in containers. Section 17 of the model ordinance addresses SB 1383's requirement to adopt an enforceable ordinance or similarly enforceable mechanism. It includes language related to establishing penalty amounts that must at a minimum meet the penalty levels specified in Article 16 of SB 1383 regulations, which range from $50 to $500 per violation. It also indicates that those penalties need to be consistent with specified sections of the government code. The penalty amounts in the regulations are presented as a range. For example, the penalty for the first violation is $50 to $100. However, jurisdictions could choose a single penalty amount rather than use the range for each violation type. But in such a case, the amount may not be lower than the lowest value on the range for violations subject to the requirements. Penalty levels are required per the regulations, and amounts must be clearly stated. The enforcement table that's included in the model ordinance is not required by SB 1383, so a jurisdiction could choose to include or delete items from the table, depending on the specifics of their final ordinance and their enforcement program, if they choose to include a table. If a jurisdiction chooses to delegate some enforcement responsibilities, it needs to consider to whom it's going to delegate and at what level. Remember, a jurisdiction is ultimately responsible for enforcement, even if the jurisdiction delegates some of the activities to another entity. For the first 2 years from January 1, 2022 through December 31st, 2023, jurisdictions are required to identify non-compliant entities and provide education to them. That's the focus. Enforcement actions, including civil penalties, however, must begin no later than January 1, 2024. But a jurisdiction could consider having penalties start earlier. The model ordinance allows for date adjustment, so jurisdictions could choose to adopt the model ordinance sooner than is required. And also please note that jurisdictions are not required to impose penalties on generators found in violation of prohibited container contaminant requirements. Jurisdictions will need to modify the enforcement language so that it conforms with their current and desired enforcement procedures. And jurisdictions may want to include enforcement requirements that are stricter than those required by SB 1383. Many municipal codes have enforcement in a general section of the code, so these provisions may need to be moved to a different code section. Section 18, the effective date. This addresses SB 1383's requirement that an ordinance or other enforceable mechanism be in place no later than January 1, 2022. Jurisdictions could choose to make the ordinance effective prior to that date to allow entities more time to come into compliance through outreach and educational efforts prior to their implementation of penalties. As we wrap up this presentation, I'd like to review some overall tips on how to use the model ordinance. The model provides example language, and it tries to address a wide range of options for customization purposes. Given the diversity of situations, the model language will need to be customized to fit the jurisdiction's needs and situation. It provides a great baseline, and while it may not be a perfect fit for each jurisdiction, it should provide a solid foundation for each jurisdiction to amend its current municipal code to integrate these SB 1383 requirements. Jurisdictions will need to adjust the model language to fit their specific needs. As I mentioned before, where the term jurisdiction is used in the document, it should be changed to city, county, city and county, special district as appropriate. When using the model ordinance, users may want to select provisions from both their current municipal code and the model to create an ordinance that best suits its needs. It's recommended that users consider modifying the existing code provisions as appropriate. However, those should be carefully reviewed to ensure alignment with compliant programs and collection approaches. Customize the model language so that it aligns with your jurisdiction's collection system, compliance approach, and franchise agreement. Highlighted guidance notes are presented for reference only and should be removed by the jurisdiction when preparing its final ordinance. In cases where the model ordinance offers multiple options, optional provisions that aren't selected should be deleted and section numbers modified accordingly. As we noted at the beginning of this presentation, each jurisdiction is ultimately responsible for its compliance with regulations, and you're advised to seek legal counsel in developing or modifying its agreement and ordinance. CalRecycle, in conjunction with HF&H Consultants, has developed a series of case studies that spotlight how jurisdictions and entities are implementing some aspects of SB 1383. They've created 2 case studies for each of the model tools. And for the model ordinance, they're showcasing enforcement ordinances from the Alameda County Waste Management Authority and the City and County of San Francisco. You can read about their implementation processes and lessons learned by following the links provided on this slide. Thank you so very much for listening. We'll use the remaining time to respond to questions and receive comments.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rob and Deborah, for the presentation. All of this is very useful for our jurisdictions. As a reminder, we will be doing some live questions. So if you could please either ask your question in the question feature or put an asterisk, you'll be called upon once you are unmuted.
All right, the first question we have is from Corinna. So I've unmuted you on our end. If you could please unmute yourself to ask your question out loud, and please state your name and affiliation. Okay, I will go ahead and ask the question. What if a business rejects service? This has happened before.
Well, businesses will be required under the ordinance to have the service, and that's why you have an enforceable ordinance, because ultimately you'll have the ability to assess penalties on businesses that refuse service. I'm not sure if I was supposed to answer that question.
Nope, you did perfect, Deborah. So we're hoping that answers your question. If not, feel free to put a follow-up question or an asterisk.
Okay, our next question is from Jennifer Gilbert. You're unmuted, so if you can unmute your phone and then share your affiliation, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Jennifer Gilbert with the City of Davis. I actually have two questions. So first of all, in section 10, regarding the food recovery organization, if the organization that we would be working with is not within our jurisdiction, is that something that we would still need to include in our ordinance? I don't know that we can actually, you know, regulate something that's not in our jurisdiction.
Yeah, Jennifer, I think the expectation is that you will be doing inspections of any food generators within your jurisdiction, as well as any FROs or FRSs that are housed physically within your jurisdiction. We recognize that you don't have police powers over entities in other jurisdictions, and hopefully those jurisdictions will be doing their enforcement.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies. And then the second part, in section 12, talking about the self-haulers, and thank you, Deborah, for qualifying that the residential landscaping services does not fall under the qualification for a self-hauler for organic waste. Does that mean a landscaping company that also services commercial properties as well is exempt from that?
No, the commercial landscapers are not exempt from the requirements. They need to properly separate and handle their materials and deliver them to an organic waste processing facility to comply with the requirements of the regulations.
And to add to Tracy's point, that is irregardless of whether they are collecting, doing landscaping for a residential household or a commercial business. So through the regulatory process and extensive discussions with jurisdictions, we define landscapers as self-haulers. Did that answer your question?
Very much. Yeah, that's what I was kind of wondering, why, when she said residential landscape services, what that was referring to then.
Yeah. I'm not sure, maybe Deborah could speak to that, but one other point I wanted to add is by putting the landscapers into the self-haul category, one of the big, container colors, another big aspect of the conversation was focused on just the challenge and the cost in tracking down self-haulers like landscapers and trying to get data from them and all of that. So through the regulatory process, we identified landscapers as self-haulers, but the self-haul requirements are that you must have in your ordinance what the requirements are. And then in your general education to all of your organic waste generators, you would provide to everyone what the self-haul requirements are. Those landscapers are required to keep the record of the amount of material in the event that the jurisdiction wants to conduct an inspection and look at those records. But they are not required to report to the jurisdiction on any, regular basis, unless the jurisdiction sets a more prescriptive or more stringent requirement. But Deborah, did you want to do any clarifying? Because there seems to be some confusion. I'm not sure.
I was, my note was that residential organic waste generators that self-haul their own organic waste. So if you're, doing some gardening and you self-haul your organic waste, that is not required to be recorded and reported.
Yeah, so that's not a landscaper. That's if I'm just, trimming my own trees and I need to take a bunch of that material to a particular facility. Did that clarify it, Jennifer?
Yes, it did. Thank you very much, Deborah, for the clarification. And thank you, Kara. That also answered a few other questions.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Celine. Celine, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Thank you all so much. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you all for this presentation and for these workshops today and tomorrow. They've been really helpful. My question is if the ordinance is the best place to address the following issue. So for jurisdictions who are looking to comply with SB 1383, or obviously have to comply with 1383, but are perhaps looking to go above and beyond in terms of what happens with their organic waste. If they have a franchise hauler that is potentially taking this waste to an anaerobic digester, for example, but there may be more sustainable options out there with regards to the EPA food recovery hierarchy, for example, diverting to animal feed. Would the ordinance be an appropriate place to address an exception, for example, to say if the hauler that we're currently working with doesn't have either good reporting or the most sustainable option that we're looking for, perhaps the ordinance could be a place to write in an exception to go outside of that hauler to seek more sustainable solutions?
HF&H.
Celine, I think this is a bit of a complex issue because yes, you probably would want to have the limitations to the exclusive scope of your agreement documented in that hauler regulation section, and there's placeholders for it, and we've even included the animal feed concept that you have. So the ordinance is a place for that. The franchise agreement is also the place for it.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things you want to be careful of is that you don't have an agreement with your service provider in your franchise agreement and then try and legislate around that agreement through your own municipal code. That'll trigger a change in law probably in their agreement. So you want to make sure that the two are harmonized and both describe it the same way.
Okay. Okay, thank you all very much for that guidance.
All right, we have our next question from Connie. You're unmuted. If you can unmute yourself and state your affiliation and your question.
I am Connie Vieira with the City of Tracy, and I actually have a few different questions. One is that came up as you guys were answering is to kind of piggyback on Jennifer's question regarding commercial landscapers. Because they are self-haul and the records that they keep, would they have to keep individual records of the different businesses that they're landscaping for that day and how much they haul? Or could they just do like, for the day, this is how much I hauled to the MRF?
There's so many of them. Oh, go ahead, Deborah.
I was just going to say, I don't think the regulations don't require it to be segregated by individual sites that they collect from. It's when they go to the facility, the aggregate amount.
Okay, perfect. And then the two questions that I came up with on my own going through it is on Section 8 for the physical space constraints. If I recall correctly, in yesterday's presentation, it was said that we would be able to log when somebody had a space constraint, but that it wouldn't be a long-term ongoing situation that would be allowed. But then in today's presentation, I heard that it could be, we just have to check on it every 5 years to make sure that it is still space constraints. Is that correct, or which one should it be?
So I'll go ahead and start. I think the nuance in that conversation is that CalRecycle's expectation, based upon our conversations with stakeholders, is that physical space waivers typically are needed for a shorter time, such that the issue can be resolved. But sometimes it takes a little while for that issue. It might mean an enclosure has to be built, or there's a different kind of container needs to be added to the service or something like that. So that's probably the nuance there. Is our expectation is that physical space waivers typically are not, from all the jurisdictions that we talk to that implement physical space waivers, typically don't do them for the long term. They're usually shorter term fixes. And Deborah, maybe you can add, because some of that intel we got was from Stop Waste and how they look at physical space waivers. Deborah?
Right. I think the confusion might be that there was a discussion about enclosures and how to handle that. The regulations require that you have a business would have space in any of the collection systems allowable. So the regulations are asking you to look at other opportunities for allowing the business to have that space. Just having an enclosure that doesn't fit a container doesn't really comply with the physical space restraint requirement. But yes, it doesn't need to be confirmed. It is an every 5-year confirmation. If indeed the business really cannot fit and does not have the space under any configurations that are allowed within the law for an organics container. So that would need to be determined by the jurisdiction.
Okay,
Kara?
that definitely helped. Thank you. And then one more question that I had is on, oh, sorry, was on section 15 for the recycled content paper. Our jurisdiction currently doesn't have recycled content paper. However, the paper that we do keep on stock that we use throughout the city and all of our departments is processed in a way to where they get twice as much paper out of each tree. So would that be considered environmentally sufficient? Or I know I'm kind of like nitpicky now, but I just want to make sure that we're good.
No, the requirement is that the paper actually has to be a recycled content paper with 30% post-consumer content. So it does not sound like that would suffice.
Okay. All right, that's all I had. Thank you so much for all of the information that you guys have been providing.
Okay, our next question is from Wanda. Wanda, you can unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hi, I'm Wanda from the city of Oakland. My question is, do the requirements for haulers and facility operators apply to recycling entities that are collecting and processing paper and cardboard?
Yes, they do.
Yes, they sure do.
Oh, this is Tracy. I'll just add a little bit more on that. I think often agencies that we're working with just sort of think about their franchise agreements and getting in compliance there. But if there are unregulated recyclers or C&D haulers that are operating, they need to be regulated through some type of system. It does not have to be a franchise. It could be a permit or license system, but the expectations, I think it's Article 7 of the regs, that haulers are regulated through some type of enforceable mechanism. And there are provisions in the model to address that.
All right, Chris Leon, you're unmuted. If you unmute your phone, you can ask your question. So I'm going to read the question. The law defines a business as a commercial or public entity, school district, California State University, community college, University of California, special district, regional agency, etc. State agencies, state university, community colleges, etc. are subject to CalRecycle regulatory authority for AB 1826. Is this expanded under 1383, including the autonomy and accountability of the University of California under the state constitution?
HF&H or Deborah, do you want to handle that first, or do you want us to jump in?
I think I'll punt that to HF&H.
Yeah, as we've talked about on a couple of these, the non-local entities, the state agents in particular, will be subject to CalRecycle's enforcement because local agencies can't enforce upon them. And so there'll have to be sort of this dual monitoring, and there are provisions within the regulations that talk about how local agencies, if they encounter issues with these non-local entities, should refer them to CalRecycle. So there will be a process there and a way of sort of handing those things off.
And then UCs are included in that. So, Chris, that was a great question. I think you nailed it. Where 341 and 1826, we had a bigger definition of what was a business and what was required of a business, and that's where you'd see the schools and the colleges. And now for 1383, there's a specific definition for those. So again, you'll look under non-local entity, and then also local education agency, which in the past was considered a business under 341 and 1826.
Okay, our next question is from Rachel. Rachel, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, this is Rachel Bosley from Stop Waste for Alameda County Waste Management Authority. Thanks for this presentation. Hi, Deborah and others. I had a question regarding, and this may have to do a little bit between the model franchise agreement and the enforcement ordinance, but it was talked about how civil penalties are not able to be designated to private entities. And I'm wondering about the situation where a jurisdiction may want to put as many franchise provisions to designate the hauler to be able to work for them as much as they can, especially under local governments hurting due to COVID and other financial reasons. So in the situation where you put in a franchise provision that says requires organic service, for instance, and the franchisee is able to assess a fee when that service is not subscribed to or that it's refused, wouldn't that be a penalty or an enforcement mechanism to assess that to the generator to get compliance?
That's an interesting concept, Rachel. So let me make sure I understand this. You're suggesting that rather than the mandatory ordinance mandating subscription to each of the required services, that the customer would pay some sort of penalty to the hauler or through the rates in some way for their failure to subscribe to service, and that it would be an incident of the franchise, not necessarily an incident of the ordinance?
Yeah, exploring that. And then also the scenario where a franchise might include provisions for proper sorting, for instance, contamination fees. And maybe that's also for good stuff in the garbage. A contamination fee is assessed, and that's another way of getting compliance or assessing,
And the prohibited container contaminant issue was specifically carved out, and that was specifically contemplated to be dealt with in the way that you're talking about, that there'd be a contamination fee or some other arrangement between the hauler and the generator in that case. We really haven't looked at that issue of could you have an other enforceable mechanism, quote unquote, through the franchise agreement, but it does run afoul of having private entities enforcing the provisions and imposing. These wouldn't be civil penalties. They would be charges or fees or surcharges of some sort. So it's sort of interesting.
Okay, so it hasn't been looked at. I mean, would that be allowable?
Yeah, Rob just threw up his hands for good reason. And that is basically, Rachel, we haven't explored it. So we'd have to explore with our legal team here to see if it would be allowed. If that's something you would like us to explore, we'd be happy to do so.
I think it would be an option that some jurisdictions may want to pursue. So I think that'd be great.
All right, great. We'll add it to our to-do list and we'll get back to you on that.
Thanks a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to take a couple more questions. I know we're going over the 2:30 mark, but I wanted to give folks more time to ask questions, if that's okay with our panelists. So maybe 10 more minutes of questions. And then for anything we can't get to today, I think we have a log of it, or you could email the SLCP inbox or your local assistance representative.
And Ashley, I'm afraid I have a hard out at 2:30, so I'll jump off, but Tracy can cover the waterfront.
All right, our next question is from Colleen. You know what to do.
Hi, thank you so much. I had a couple questions, but I think I'll try to paraphrase a couple of them. You did answer the C&D question. I guess I'm struggling with the edible food requirements. I know it's been mentioned a couple times now that potentially the inspections could be done by the county. But I mean, our own county here in San Diego, they don't do those inspections. They struggle with being equipped to do their own requirements. So I'm wondering, have you seen the counties across the state agree to do these inspections? Are they informed and educated on food recovery? I know spending some time in the food recovery space for the past few years, we've been actually trying to educate county health departments. And I still think there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
I'll start. We have just identified several and work with several jurisdictions that are planning to engage with the Department of Environmental Health, but I haven't seen any sort of agreements formalized yet. So they're still, I would say, in the early stages of discussion, and I haven't seen anything solidly come out of that yet. So I don't know, Kara, if in your group working with individual jurisdictions has any more experience or any examples that you can share, that would be helpful.
Yeah, well, I can say that CCDH Environmental Health has been a partner in this. We've collaborated with them in developing the regulatory requirements. So the degree to which we need to do maybe do more outreach to county environmental health, that would be great feedback, Colleen, and we can certainly have the team add that to our to-do list, because I think that's really important. You know, I appreciate that there could be some departments that, you know, maybe are not as familiar, and we definitely would want to outreach to them.
And I think I just asked that because it's actually, I think, a great strategy, but it's hard when it's mismatched across the state, right? So if this is a state regulation and a requirement, it seems like it would be appropriate for the state to engage the health department and then make that a norm across the state. So that I think that would take a lot of relief off of jurisdictions if that component of inspections and maybe record keeping could be done by, you know, an overall department that oversees all the counties. So just an idea on that end.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's a little surprising to me because in all of our conversations with environmental health folks, that was kind of always the thinking behind it. So our team will do some follow-up, and maybe we need to do some follow-up with CCDH and others. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. And then just secondly, my questions, it really does go around the space constraints. I mean, I don't know what area Stop Waste is looking at, but I mean, if you look at the majority of Southern California along the coast, it was all built over 100 years ago. I mean, I just rolled out mandatory recycling for 1,000 businesses in the past 3 months. If I would have allowed the physical space waivers, I would have almost half of them at minimum would have qualified for a physical space waiver, and none of those would have been temporary because they're at businesses that are in a building that was built in 1910. So it just really makes it fundamentally, financially, and programmatically impossible to meet these requirements for diversion and to allow kind of this weird waiver. So I really am struggling behind your argument that this is temporary. I mean, if the state is really seeing these physical space waivers as temporary, it may be helpful to support jurisdictions in encouraging them not to adopt the waivers. Because ultimately, from a compliance perspective, you're looking at them as only a temporary option, which really puts, I think, you know, really puts the argument forward that jurisdictions should not allow for these waivers, especially in high density areas, urban environments in California.
Well, that's totally something that you can decide in your jurisdiction, and those waivers are optional. So you may not want to include that in your final ordinance.
Well, and I understand that, but I think I'm asking for help. It's really hard for a little old city to do something stricter than the whole state of California for the biggest, you know, solid waste and recycling regulation in the past 30 years. So, you know, if it gets out there that our city is not allowing a waiver that the state authorizes, even though it's kind of willy-nilly, it's extremely difficult to push forward with a mandatory program. So it becomes limiting. And I think the vagueness around this physical space waiver is going to create a lot of liabilities for jurisdictions.
Yeah, thank you, Colleen. I know you've made these points throughout the regulatory process. I think where I stand is that if jurisdictions are facing that situation, then, you know, we would be there to help provide that support. It was something that in the end we decided to allow because we had enough folks that felt it was important. But again, we are when the final regulatory package, including the final statement of reasons, is published, you will see that the intention for physical space waivers is meant to be temporary in nature. And to the degree that we need to emphasize that with any particular jurisdictions, I'm happy to do that. So I do appreciate the concerns that you're raising, and certainly it is something that we're here to provide support so that you are not on the front lines having to deal with, you know, the feedback from folks. But I appreciate it, and I do hear you.
And thank you for that response on the temporary. I think that actually does help, as I think was what I'm also saying. So that's an opportunity for increased education. So thank you.
Yeah, and the degree to which I think, I'll double check some of our frequently asked questions that we have, but I believe we strongly emphasize the temporary nature for physical space. But our team will double check that, but I'm pretty sure we're emphasizing it there as well as in the final statement of reasons.
Okay, our next question is from Christina. Christina, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Christina calling from the city of Riverside, California. And okay, so my question is, we have recently added an ordinance, added the chapter 606 to the Riverside Municipal Code for the recycling as well as organic recycling requirements for solid waste customers. Does this ordinance suffice to actually include the SB 1383, or do we have to actually, are we required to implement a separate ordinance just for the SB 1383?
It's likely that the requirements of SB 1383 will require some modifications to whatever ordinance you currently have, and you need to look through those requirements, look through the model ordinance, and make sure those things are covered.
Oh, okay.
I would add to that, this is Tracy, I would add, it sounds like you're talking about having some type of mandatory requirements for your generators. You do need to make sure they align with the requirements, as Deborah mentioned, but there's also other pieces that we've been talking about, like the requirements for the self-haulers, the requirements for edible food generators and food recovery organizations that need to get integrated. So it's likely that you will need to make some type of modifications to your ordinance. You can amend your existing ordinance. You do not need to adopt the standalone ordinance. And that may be easier just to pull these pieces into it. But the reality is, I'm sure there'll be some types of changes necessary.
Yeah, and then just to add to that, Christina, looking at what you have here, if the CalGreen requirements are addressed elsewhere in the municipal code, you won't have to amend this ordinance that you're referencing. And then performance-based is really only related to a jurisdiction that is implementing a performance-based collection service. So I'm just guessing maybe Riverside won't be in that boat, at least initially. So if it's just those two things, and you've, as Tracy and Deborah explained, you know, you went through the model and you went, I've got this, I've got this, I've got that, and CalGreen is covered elsewhere and you're not doing performance-based, you may be golden. But it is good just to set them side by side and make sure that you have all of the necessary requirements included in your ordinance.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, we have a remaining question from Rosie Ledesma. If you can unmute your phone.
Hi, Rosie Ledesma, City of Woodland. It's kind of a two-part question. If we don't have enforcement authority over non-local entities, are we still required to provide them outreach and education on 1383? and letting them know about all of the compliance measures?
Yes.
Okay. And what about the so I understand the CalRecycle will be doing the enforcement on these non-local entities, but what about the waivers or self-hauling compliance measures and things like that? Will that be done through CalRecycle, or will we be doing those parts?
Yeah, great question. No, that will be done through CalRecycle, and the regulations are written as such. So waiver requests would be administered through CalRecycle for local education agencies and non-local entities.
Okay, so for the initial part, we just need to keep them aware of the requirements, what they need to do, but the actual enforcement or any other kind of regulatory things or compliance measures would be done through you guys.
Exactly, including edible food would be done through us.
Great.
Yeah.
And like Jennifer said earlier, Alan, it's good to see you too.
And the regulations for education and outreach say jurisdiction has to provide education to all of the organic waste generators located in the jurisdiction. So that's why those folks need education as well.
Great, thank you.
Perfect. So we've reached our extra 10 minutes, so we're going to wrap up right now. But as a reminder, if you have any further questions, and I do see some in the queue, which we'll be able to pull a report on, so we will be getting back to you. But if you have additional questions, please contact your local assistance representative or email the SLCP inbox. As a friendly reminder, tomorrow at 10 o'clock, we'll have a procurement policy presentation. And then at 1 o'clock, we'll have our edible food recovery agreement presentation. So thank you all for your participation, and thank you, Deborah and HF&H, for putting on this PowerPoint. And we will hopefully see you tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.